So the first speaker today on our list is Matthew Sangster, who I've had the great pleasure of knowing through the auspices of the British Association for Romantic Studies. Some years ago he was one of our postgraduate reps and did fine work on the executive. Since then he's completed a PhD on authors' lives, and he's also worked on the Royal Literary Fund archive and catalogued it. So without further ado, Matthew.
So my title is Party Like It's 1842, The Literary Fund's Road to Royalty. And that title is of course a reference to the work of a noted media theorist whose name is also a scandalous Georgian headline, Prince Rogers Nelson. As it happens, while I knew when I gave David my title that I wanted to discuss 1842, in the course of the archival work it became apparent that 1799 was going to feature, so it turns out I missed a trick. The title was partly chosen whimsically, although the paper does wind its way towards a prince. It is in large part about boozing and about performance. Before traversing the road to royalty, though, I'd like to dwell briefly on a couple of thoughts on the nature of partying suggested by Prince's song. 1999 makes it very clear that a party is both chronologically specific and chronologically sensitive. The phrase, "tonight we're going to party like it's 1999, divides time into moments before, which focus inevitably down on a celebration determined to mark itself out against an uncertain future. In the song's specific case, the moment of the party is suspended on the cusp of an approaching Armageddon. As Michael Hill Riley noted in his Rolling Stone review, the song finds Prince shaking his booty disapprovingly at the threat of nuclear annihilation. I will touch later on some of the ways that parties serve as means of mirroring and resisting wider fears. The broader idea I want to draw out here is that of the party as participatory performance, built through anticipation and looking towards future remediation, even as it resists this in the moment. The song's collective we is crucial. For a party to occur, a consensus on its happening and on its nature must be assembled. An incipient party creates a narrative that partygoers buy into, perform, or in some cases resist, and a narrative which ideally should sustain itself in memory. One might consider 1999's own reception as an example, as chronological specificity manifesting in changing meanings. When first released in 1982, the song's lyric was a statement of futurism, reaching forward. When it was re-released in November 1998, it was about a rapidly approaching now. Now that its namesake date has passed, it's become freighted with nostalgia. A more literary example of the ways that parties bend time can be found in Pride and Prejudice, the early sections of which point inevitably towards the Netherfield ball. After having danced every dance at the first ball he attends, in Chapter 3 Mr. Bingley talks of giving one himself at Netherfield. This event finally occurs in Chapter 18, but not before it has been the subject of discussion in the majority of the chapters between, with characters repeatedly reconfiguring its significance. To give a few examples, in Chapter 9, on being abruptly reminded by Lydia of his promise and informed that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep to it, Bingley replies, "I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement, and when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball." By this point, both for soldier-stricken Lydia and for Bingley, the ball has become focus of more specific hopes. In Chapter 11, Miss Bingley attempts to impress Darcy by reimagining the oncoming event to better suit his supposed tastes, asserting that it would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing were made the order of the day. Bingley, though, asserts that the genre of the ball is only flexible to a certain extent, replying, "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I dare say, but it will not be near so much like a ball." In Chapter 17, the parameters of the moment have become tightly defined in the imaginations of the Bennet family, each of whom projects it as an agreeable prospect, with slightly different emphases. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it given as given in compliment to her eldest daughter, was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends and the attentions of their brother. Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behaviour. The happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr. Wickham, he was by no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was, at any rate, a ball, and even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. For the characters here, with the possible exception of Jane, the ball serves as an occasion for demonstrative performance, whether that be possessive, challenging, flirtatious, or intellectual. However, all these performances misfire to a greater or lesser extent, most doing so most seriously in the eyes of Mr. Darcy. Despite her feelings, Jane's outward diffidence makes it seem as though her heart was not likely to be easily touched. and this, combined with Mrs. Bennet's premature crowing and the total want of propriety displayed by Mr. Bennet and the younger members of the family, leads Darcy to conspire to remove his friend from Netherfield. The ball's positive effects are thus delayed, but it lingers with those who are present. On meeting Elizabeth again at Lambton, Bingley remarks, "We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Elizabeth, noting the significant all, is pleased to find his memory so exact. An event like a ball, then, is a confluence of more or less formalised modes of interaction with a complex network of personal objectives and local specificities. If such an event succeeds, it bends time, both real and narrative, around itself, inflecting the time previous to its occurrence with expectations, and the time after with retellings and rememberings. I've yet really to come to the subject of this paper, the anniversary dinners held by the Literary Fund. In some ways, these were rather different events, appearing from the Fund's archive to be more formal civic occasions, designed to represent the Fund to its supporters and public. However, records for the earliest dinners are fragmentary, and even for later years the main sources are official correspondence, administrative papers, and press coverage, the latter often influenced by friendships and by canny invitations. In part, therefore, I've spent time with Austen's characters to highlight the things we cannot know. We can discover who sat where and how much they paid for tickets. We're not usually privy to what neighbours talk about, or what their motives for attendance were. What survives is largely an official narrative. The interactions and contingencies which Austen describes so well are in most cases unrecorded. There are, however, affinities between Austen's imagined parties and the Fund's real ones. Austen and the Fund's conductors both recognise the potency of performative social occasions and the importance of publicly representing character. While Austen's parties serve to reveal personal character, though, or fail to reveal it, the Funds were designed to cope with the problem of reifying its identity by providing focal moments which would assert its value as both a useful and a national institution. This often proved to be a difficult task. While it is relatively easy to represent a party in literature, it is trickier to represent literature at a party. First, a little background. The Literary Fund was founded in 1790 by the philosopher, theologian and educationalist David Williams, initially with a small group of clubbable friends. Its purpose, according to an early advertisement, was to withdraw those apprehensions of extreme poverty and those desponding views of futurity which lead genius and talent from the path of virtue, prostitute them to pernicious factions, and convert the liberty of the press into a detestable and unsufferable licence. In practice, these lofty goals were achieved by providing confidential grants to authors in financial difficulties. Unfortunately, raising the funds to accomplish this worthy goal proved tricky. The major problem Williams faced was that since the fund was committed to aiding its applicants confidentially, he could produce no symbols of misery, no actual specimens and scenes to engage that compassion and humanity on which he was obliged to place its first reliance. The fund's first recourse was to advertisements. These only drew in enough money to pay to perpetuate them. A number of subscribers were rustled up through friendships and networking, but these were not sufficient for building up any sort of reserve. After further approaches to patrons and some dabbling with theatricals, the Funds Committee decided to take a course suggested by John Nichols, an influential publisher and the proprietor of the Gentleman's Magazine. On the 3rd of May 1793, therefore, they resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that it will conduce very much to the interest of this society to have an anniversary dinner. The first dinner was held on Friday the 31st of May that year at the Crown and Anchor in the Strand. Tickets are sold at 7 shillings and 6pence each. The committee resolved that 5 tickets be sent to each of the officers and to each member of the committee, and 2 tickets to each of the subscribers resident in London or within reasonable distance. Notice was placed in the usual public papers. On the evening itself, according to the General Evening Post, recitations principally of original compositions, songs by amateurs of great taste, and toasts adapted to the occasion harmonised the random and scattered wit of the irritable race of poets, and the feast of animated and amusing conversation was prolonged to a late hour. The article was reprinted in The World and The Star, and a truncated version appeared on page 3 of The Sun. The dinner thus advertised the fund 3 times, once in prospect, once in its occurrence, and once in its being reported as a pleasant event. It also provided 3 opportunities for raising funds, by selling tickets, by encouraging donations at the dinner, and by drawing in new subscribers through positive coverage. The dinner proved to be a considerable success and rapidly grew in scale. 86 dined in 1794, 160 in 1797, and 250 in 1799. Such numbers necessitated a sizable venue. With a few exceptions, the fund employed the Freemasons' Tavern from 1796. In attempting to raise its reputation, the fund faced a series of logistical issues common to all dinners: how to arrange the diners, what to serve, what date to choose, and so forth. However, it also faced specific challenges with regard to presenting itself. Having a dinner would help to bring together a community, but more was needed to turn that community into supporters of the fund as a national institution. The surviving tavern bills make it clear that alcohol was a crucial element in the fund's attempts at persuasion. The bill for 1800, which is relatively typical, records that 314 diners got through 294 bottles of port and 69 bottles of sherry. Evidence from later bills indicates this was probably drunk in addition to table wine, and the 1800 bill also includes line items for additional quantities of strong beer, brandy, porter, punch, and negus, a delicious-sounding drink made from wine or port, spiced and sugared. The conviviality created by booze extended into the newspaper reports, the last lines of which often noted the late hour at which the company rose as a sign of the dinner's success. Boozy conviviality, though, could only create an unfocused kind of goodwill. The dinner sought to channel this into admiration for the fun through long sequences of toasts, recitations, and speeches, sensibly located after people had eaten the dinner itself. Some saw its speaking slots as being quite desirable. A young subscriber, Charles Monk, on being refused the chance to read his poetry in 1805, wrote to one of the fund's registrars, Charles Simmons, that "I really feel that in the talent of elocution I might have effected more than probably the committee or yourself are well aware." Simmons was unmoved, even when Monk argued in a second letter that one additional quarter of an hour would add very little to the time usually devoted at dinner to such exhibitions, and if I misapply that short moment by setting people asleep, I shall be justly punished for my vanity. Monk was permitted to perform in 1806 after effectively bribing the committee with new subscribers. When he expressed a wish to perform again the following year, David Williams was forced to assert that the society was determined to manage its public meetings not only with decorum, but in that manner which will best promote the purposes of the institution. This cannot be done without limiting the number of recitations, by which the audience is frequently wearied and all festivity destroyed. Monk's evoking his supposed talent for elocution highlights the fact that at its dinners the fund was required to represent literature in a form markedly different to that which it sought to reward in its charitable work. Williams' response is indicative of the extent to which the dinners were stage-managed performances, designed to fill the void left by the fund's applicants' anonymity. Despite its assertions about festivities being destroyed by recitations, these comprised a large part of the fund's self-presentation. The toast list for 1800 contains 22 separate items. Under rough calculation indicates that the speeches in 1842, the first dinner for which they were fully recorded, would have gone on for at least an hour and a half. This does not include the time taken up by 9 interpolated musical performances. Poetical addresses by officers of the fund played a regular role in the early dinners. Those who recited, including the songwriting army officer Thomas Morris, the poet laureate Henry James Pye, the lawyer William Boss Corwin, the author Isaac Disraeli, and Samuel Birch, one of the aldermen of the City of London. Others also contributed occasionally. Acceding to a request, George Crabbe wrote praise of the fund into the third letter in the Borough and sent this to be read at the 1809 dinner. The most celebrated and notorious of the fund's performers, though, was William Thomas Fitzgerald, whose 35 years of loyal effusions did a great deal to establish the fund as a respectable institution. I'm going to focus for a few minutes on a particular recitation by Fitzgerald. His address to the company assembled at Freemasons' Building on the anniversary of the Literary Fund, May the 2nd, 1799, a work both representative of the strategies which the fund employed and one which marshalled them with notable success. In its account of the 1799 dinner, the Anti-Jacobin Review muttered darkly that the fund's founders were neither men remarkable for the purity of their religious tenets nor for the soundness of their political principles, perhaps referring particularly to David Williams, whose deist liturgy and travels to France after the Revolution had made him an object of considerable suspicion. However, the review asserted that the fund was, at the present time, subject to the control and management of men whose characters are all that the best moralist and most loyal subject can desire. It substantiated this with a very positive account of the 1799 anniversary. The meeting was very numerous. Lord Dudley attended as president, and the chair was ably filled by Sir James Bland Burgess. The toasts were loyal and appropriate. Some energetic lines from the pen of the poet laureate were recited after dinner by a young gentleman. Mr. Boss Corwin, the able translator of Horace, repeated an excellent ode of his own composition, and Mr. Fitzgerald, alike distinguished for the benevolence of his heart and the endowments of his mind, made a spirited and masterly appeal not only to the feelings but to the judgment of the company in a copy of the verses which we shall here subjoin. Several songs were sung by professional singers who attended for the purpose, and Lord Newark sung, in a superior style, some loyal stanzas taken, coincidentally, from the Anti-Jacobin Review for January 1799. The evening was passed in a most rational manner. The company, not less respectable than numerous, were gay but not boisterous, convivial but not intemperate. Fitzgerald here then has figures as the centrepiece of the fund's respectability, and his are the words chosen to translate the dinner from occasion into print. The text that follows, though, seems to modernise undistinguished. However, we are at a considerable remove from the social environment in which this address was produced, being ourselves the products of romantic ideologies which have transformed conceptions of what poetry is and what it should do. Elocution and recitation were key parts of literary sociability in the early 19th century. Canonical examples include Wordsworth at the Immortal Dinner and water sculpts performing and subsequently appropriating Kubla Khan, a poem which persisted for nearly 20 years in sound rather than in type. Charles Lamb, for one, was unsure whether it would survive a transition into print, writing to Wordsworth, "I am almost afraid that Kubla Khan is an owl that won't bear daylight. I fear lest it should be discovered by the lantern of typography and clear reducing the letters, no better than nonsense or no sense." As an experiment, then, I want to read Fitzgerald's 1799 address in full. Fortunately, it's only about 4 minutes long rather than the 15 minutes which Monk indicated he would need. To get in the right frame of mind, you should remember that you are the sort of gentleman who can afford a half-guinea ticket, that you've just had a good meal, that you're on your way to being horrendously drunk. Is there a sight the heart can hold more dear than what humanity contemplates here? Pure's the delight that animates the breast to see you throng, to succour the distressed. Mains of Butler, Otway, Dryden rise, behold an object grateful to your eyes. England at last atoning for her crime, England that starved the wicked, the witty and sublime, with contrite feelings opes her ample store, and bids the sons of genius starve no more. 'Tis said that some oppose your foes, and think that literature engenders woes. Such would bring back a barbarous age again, for none but vandals persecute the pen. Though some profane the muse's gift divine, and bow at avarice or ambition's shrine, though some illiberal satires pen employ, and mingle hemlock in the cup of joy, pierce the recesses of domestic life, expose the husband or defame the wife, the tale of scandal bring to public eye, and in smooth numbers circulate the lie, the muse's happier office is to prove the bond of friendship and the lamp of love, to harmonise the passions of the mind, to please, instruct, and meliorate mankind. By her the selfish feelings are suppressed, and social virtues kindled in the breast. She points to nature's wise and generous plan, and shows how strongly man depends on man. This sacred truth the thatched-roofed peasant owns, and ermine monarchs feel it on their thrones. A loyal zeal for freedom she inspires, and fans with divine breath the patriot's fires. Is there a man so base, so lost to shame, who does not venerate the patriot's name? Not the proud leader of a selfish crew who'd grind the many to enrich the few, but he who, active in his country's cause, asserts her liberties, maintains her laws, whose upright mind perceives no private end, at once the monarch's and the people's friend, who stems oppression, which much oftener springs from tyrant factions than from tyrant kings, arms for his sovereign, to his standard flies, for freedom conquers, or for freedom dies. Not for that fiend detested by the good that bathed unhappy France with kindred blood, that brutalized a nation once humane, whose sire is discord and whose offspring pain, that drinks the tears despairing orphans shed, tortures the living and insults the dead, that leads from crime to crime, from bad to worse, the people's tyrant and the people's curse, which like a torrent bursting every mound destroys the harvest, desolates the ground, saps the foundation of the loftiest tower, and whelms the work of ages in an hour. This Gallic demon, hated by the wise, shuns the keen searching of the patriot's eyes. 'Tis not for his country's foe he braves in burning climes or on the stormy waves, but for that freedom, native of our soil, that dignifies command and sweetens toil, whose graceful form unbent by time appears, blooming as youth, though sanctified by years, for British liberty, that draws the line twixt wild democracy and the right divine, with equal zeal the monarch's power maintains, and guards the subject from despotic chains. A slave who once imbibes the English air, freed from his fetters, owns the goddess there, when heaven these words in voice of thunder spoke, "The tree of freedom is the British oak." Excuse the warmth with which my muse expressed the subject nearest, dearest to my breast, but when the foes of earth and heaven conspire to desolate the world with sword and fire, each honest man's a patriot at the heart, and burns to take his king's and country's part. When time has swept the present race away, and friends to science celebrate this day, remembrance shall, with more than pleasure, name and give your liberal patronage to fame, to rival genius. Mutual envy past, succeeding ages shall be just at last, and he who first this noble fabric raised shall with no common gratitude be praised. Time, that destroys the hero's trophied bust, shall spare the blue bay that blossoms o'er his dust. As I hope was clear, some care has been taken with the address's form in order to make it sound good. The ringing heroic couplets, mostly end-stopped rather than jummed, are well suited to easy comprehension. What's immediately striking, though, is the great bodge of patriotism sandwiched between the two passages on the literary fund and the social value of literature. Ostensibly, this has very little to do with the matter in hand. However, here we return both to Prince on chronological specificity and the question of how to represent literature at a dinner. This poem was performed 7 years into a European-wide war, at a time when a French invasion has seemed a distinct possibility. Just as Prince's 1999 was a party on the edge of destruction, so too potentially was the Fund's 1799 dinner. Fitzgerald's poem recognises this common fear and makes the Fund party to its rejection. The Fund's case can thus be made based on Britishness rather than aesthetics or political economy, both tough subjects for the dinner table and hard modes for the Fund to employ while maintaining its applicants' confidentiality. By making the Fund about British liberty, Fitzgerald pitches its tent on common ground, making aiding authors a matter of national pride. By being timely, performative, and by fudging the issue of literary quality through recourse to shared values, Fitzgerald conjures the Fund as a progressive agent of national glory. This poem was hugely popular, reprinted in full in papers and periodicals, including the Morning Chronicle, the Star, the Gentleman's Magazine, and the Edinburgh Magazine, where amusingly it's printed just before Wordsworth's Goody Blake and Harry Gill. It was also performed by request at a number of later dinners, possibly in 1808 as Fitzgerald's Recitation on English Liberty, certainly in 1811 as recorded in the British Press, and again in 1817 and 1827 as recorded in the Morning Post. In 1824, 25 years after its debut, the Post reprinted a large part of the poem after Fitzgerald recited it with powerful effect and to continued and loud applause. Fitzgerald's verse, though, was not universally admired. He was the subject of the first of James and Horace Smith's rejected addresses, Loyal Effusions, which contrived to have him blame Napoleon for the fire at the Drury Lane Theatre. He was also the first person attacked in English bards and Scotch reviewers, which opens, "Still must I hear, shall horse Fitzgerald bawl his creaking couplets in a tavern hall." Fitzgerald here himself made light of Byron's attack in a copy of English bards which passed under his eye, writing the following squib: "I find Lord Byron scorns my muse, our fates are ill agreed. His verse is safe, I can't abuse, those lines I never read." Byron subsequently came across this and wrote a response. "What's writ on me," cried Fitz, "I never read. What's wrote by thee, dear Fitz, none will indeed. The case stands simply this then, honest Fitz, thou and thy enemies are fairly quits, or rather would be, if for time to come they luckily were deaf, or thou wert dumb. But to their pens while scribblers add their tongues, the waiter only can escape their lungs." While Byron is attacking Fitzgerald specifically here, his rhetoric posits a kind of imposture in public address. Fitzgerald verse is loud and unrefined, but this would be less problematic if it was not forced on listeners. Byron here signals a move in poetry away from public sociability and towards bookishness and intimacy of the kind that powered his own sales and celebrity. The increasing tendency to see literature incarnated in books rather than in men made performances of the kind Fitzgerald specialised in seem outmoded and crass. In response to this shift, the Literary Fund dinner changed significantly after 1799. It remained a boozy occasion and became an increasingly expensive one, with prices rising to 12 shillings in 1806, 15 in 1808, and 20 in 1824. The ways that the Fund represented itself, though, altered significantly. While in 1820 the committee asserted that poetic recitation constituted a distinguished part of the festival, it became increasingly uncommon. Fitzgerald's performed at all the dinners up until 1828, but other poetry slipped off the agenda after the mid-1810s. Indication of these other changes can be given with reference to the Fund's surviving toast list. Some toasts were predictable chestnuts. Prosperity to the Literary Fund was commonly drunk early in the proceedings, and variants were often drunk later, in 1800, to the memory of depressed and departed men of genius, who possibly may rejoice in the spectacle of this day, and in 1809, and for some years after, may the blossoms of genius be never blighted by the frost of neglect. Toasts to the ladies, such as 1805's "Nature's most brilliant production, the females of the British Isles," commonly closed the proceedings, even before women were permitted to attend them. Just as Fitzgerald's poetry dwelled on the war with France while it persisted, so too did other toasts. In 1803, the company drank "The United Kingdom, the Asylum of Liberty, the Terror of Despots." In 1805, "May an invading enemy find every Briton a soldier," and in 1808, "The wooden walls of Old England, the Navy." Toasts often thanked benefactors or officers. In 1814, and a number of other years, glasses were raised to the Fund's earliest major donor, Thomas Newton, Esquire, our liberal benefactor. And in the years after William's death in 1816, the memory of our founder was drunk. In 1818, a toast thanks Sir Benjamin Hobhouse, an active vice president, for his zealous exertions in obtaining our charter. During the 1810s, though, poetry, patriotism and self-reference began to pall. The dinner's attendance declined from 200 men in 1810 to only 120 by 1820. Literary Gazette, noting this decline, complained that the Fund resembled too much a close borough or a parochial junta. The 1821 dinner marked the beginning of a revamp which focused increasingly on civic engagement and on attracting starry lists of prominent guests. In 1822, toasts were raised to the illustrious diplomatic personages and the foreigners of distinction who have honoured us with their company, and to the Right Honourable George Canning, the Governor-General-elect of India. In 1823, to Greece, the parent of the fine arts, and the members of the Greek Church who have honoured us with their company on this occasion. From the early 1820s, the fund also praised its fellow institutions. The toast list for 1822 included the Royal Society of Literature and the Royal Academy, and an expanded version in 1825 added the Universities of the United Kingdom, the Royal Society, and the Royal Asiatic Society of London, about which more later. 1825 also marked the appearance of named respondents for toasts to different branches of literature, with the Poets of Great Britain being answered by George Crowley, and the Drama being answered by George Coleman. 1829 dinner began a practice of formally coupling famous names with toasts, examples including Dr. Lardner and the University of London, Mr. Moore and the Poets of Great Britain, and Sir Edmund Carrington and the Literary Societies of our Indian Empire. This pattern continued through the 1830s. 1836, for example, saw glasses raised to Mr. Beaumont and periodical literature, Mr. Holman and the Travellers, Mr. Fitzstephen French and Irish literature, and Mr. Alan Cunningham and the Bards of Scotland. The fund's strategy then began to rely on newly emergent forms of celebrity rather than nationally inflected performances, moving away from creative recitations given by its officers and towards speeches about literature given by the great and good, including renowned authors. The culmination of this process occurred after the appointment of a ferociously efficient secretary, Octavian Blewett, in 1839. Blewett took the anniversaries in hand, sending hundreds of invitations, carefully planning the dinners, and ensuring full reports were made. The fund was therefore well placed when Prince Albert, who was trying to burnish his reputation through cultural involvement, agreed to serve as chairman for the 1842 dinner. Nearly 400 attended, including ambassadors, lords, officers of the Army and Navy, MPs and authors, as well as many of the fund's members and subscribers. Even Wordsworth was almost tempted, first accepting an invitation before writing again to decline a couple of days later. In the words of the Morning Chronicle, "An assemblage more numerous, more brilliant in point of talent and rank, and more enthusiastic in the cause which drew it together has not, as we believe, been known in the annals of the institution." Washington Irving, who had attended mainly in order to catch up with Thomas More, wrote rather less hyperbolically that the dinner was very splendid, and there was much dull speaking from various distinguished characters. The speeches at the dinner make clear the extent to which the fund succeeded in making itself part of the establishment. Prince Albert toasted the Queen, the Duke of Cumberland toasted the rest of the royal family, the Marquis of Northampton toasted the Church, coupled with the name of His Grace the Archbishop of Dublin. Vice-Chancellor Knight Bruce toasted the Army and Navy, and Admiral Colville and Colonel Gurwood responded. The Archbishop acknowledged that literature was doing good service to the Church, and Gurwood asserted that the highest exploits of our arms would become mere traditions if they were not recorded on the page of the historian, or embalmed in the immortal verse of the poet. Prince Albert proposed prosperity to the literary fund. The Marquis of Lansdowne, the president of the fund, toasted Prince Albert, noting in doing so that the fund's mission is a noble one, and yet, in many instances, it is extremely painful to those who have undertaken the administration of its benefits to find with sorrow and surprise that there is no class of intellect, however high, which is exempt from the vicissitudes which seem to be the common lot of authors by profession. Chevalier Bunsen, speaking for the King of Prussia, rejoiced to bear testimony to the value of the institution and hoped that its fame and welfare would be perpetual. Thomas Campbell proposed Henry Hallam and the historians of England. Thomas More represented the poets, G.P.R. James the novelists, Thomas Talfourd the dramatists, and Washington Irving the literature of the United States. All these responded at lesser or greater length. More, despite protesting that he did not intend to offer commonplaces, asserted that there was one reflection which cannot but arise on such an occasion, and that is, how few have been the instances, at all times and climes, of that rare bird upon the earth, a rich poet. Irving recorded in his diary that he had found More that evening with all the cares and troubles of the world thickening upon him, and perhaps it was this that led More to reflect on his most successful contemporary. We have had in our own time one illustrious instance where wealth seemed to spring up under the steps of the enchanter as rapidly as the successive miracles of his own matchless genius. But alas, not even here has there been exemption from the common lot. The works themselves are for all time, but that structure of wealth which they called up, and which seemed to rise higher and higher at each new spell of the magician, has even already, I fear, vanished, adding one more to the many fulfilments of that beautiful but melancholy presage that where such fairies once have danced, no grass will grow. By this point in its history, the fund had assisted over 700 authors, including Coleridge, Chateaubriand, Charlotte Lennox, Robert Bloomfield, Leigh Hunt, and John Clare, to name a few famous examples. In citing the example of Scott, though, and slightly misquoting a famous line from Abraham Cowley's The Complaint, More obviated the need for direct reference to any of these applicants. Scott's spectacular bankruptcy was the perfect case to prove that even the most exalted literary career could end in ruin. Cowley's line, nearly 200 years old by this point, was pressed into service, as Dryden, Otway and Butler were by Fitzgerald, to evoke a lineage of genius is failed by society. Moore's rhetoric, though, is quite different from Fitzgerald's, being struck through with melancholy. While Fitzgerald offered the fund as a progressive solution to the national problem of authorial neglect, Moore drew on more rarefied and modern versions of genius, which placed authors at a remove from the social order, never wholly able to understand them or compensate them for their pains, a mode of authorship which could only be alluded to at a celebration like the Literary Funds and never demonstrated there. Faith in this modern form of neglected genius, promoted to mass readers through celebrity and biography, made it considerably easier for the fund to persuade the establishment to help it support anonymous authors. Prince Albert must have been convinced, at any rate, as soon after the 1842 dinner, the Literary Fund was granted the right to add royal to its title. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker, as advertised, we'll move straight on, as I said earlier, is Laure Philippe, who's going to speak on the subject of French émigré novelists and the London publishing community in the 1790s. Laure tells me she's French and she's currently undertaking a PhD at the University of Warwick.
Thank you.
Would you like a drink?
Yes, please.
Not on the top, but go on from the file.
Oh yeah, slideshow, yeah. Yeah. I've got the old PowerPoint version.
That's all right.
Okay. So I will start by presenting my research project a bit and historically resituating the status of the French émigré who lived in London from the Revolution until the first decades of the 19th century. So first, what is an émigré? The term émigré was especially coined by the revolutionary government for those fleeing from the Bastille's fall in 1789, who were sentenced with death until Napoleon's amnesty in 1800. Today in French it is used for anybody leaving his country for reasons other than leisure. The number of émigrés reached about 150,000 in total and 25,000 for England only. Thus, the visibility of French émigrés in London, their reason for emigrating, and the degree of integration into the metropolitan cultural communities needs to be more systematically examined. The émigrés attracted far less scholarly interest than their predecessors, the Huguenots, for example. Émigrés were actively involved in the editing and publishing of newspapers. For instance, London recently was seen as an émigré news centre by Simon Burroughs, where émigré journalists participated in the creation of a revolutionary political culture. This makes the study of émigré individuals less of an isolated case in the historiography by relating it to a pan-European publishing trade at the start of the 19th century. Some émigrés did more artistic professions, making the most of the skills they possessed as aristocrats. Monsieur de Briot de Lonjac was teaching singing and the guitar. Madame de Cornulier gave French lessons. The Comte d'Estrées and his son specialized in painting frescoes and castles, while other noblewomen became seamstresses or hat makers. Others got really involved with cultural associations, such as communal libraries, reading societies, or book selling. I will focus solely on 3 French noblewomen today, all exiles in London between 1789 and 1814. So I will show you the first one. Adélaïde de Souza. She stayed in London between 1793 and 94. She was a prolific novelist from her exile onwards, but the first novel she wrote while in exile was Adèle de Sénange, which I will talk about a bit later. Adèle de Boigne, here. She was in London between 1789 and 1805. She wrote memoirs and 2 forgotten novels. And finally, Claire de Duras, who stayed between 1796 and 1800 and published 2 novels in the 1820s, which were very successful. Looking at female émigrés is very significant because studies on the immigration are scarce and tend to focus on the most visible male characters, but also because the relationship between written texts, like novels, and the concrete lives of French exile has never been explored and constitutes, in my opinion, a very fruitful element to investigate. My case study of feminine émigré texts offer an outsider's outlook on the reflection on metropolitan cultural institutions. It seems that for those French women, British cultural institutions had two functions. It provided a safer realm in which to publish, and also it fed their literary inspiration, challenging their preconception about British culture. A prolonged stay in London meant that emotions were entangled with a specific aspect of British culture and invested into fiction. I will take the case of Madame de Souza first to show that the immigration in London encouraged immigrant female writers to assert their authorship. So Madame de Souza published Adèle de Sénange. I will translate now an extract from the preface. This essay was started at a time that seemed to impose to a woman, a mother, the need to get away from everything real, to stop thinking, and it was finished in the intervals of a slow and painful deterioration. Alone in a foreign land, with a child that had reached the age when education must no longer be delayed, I felt a kind of sweetness to think that his first lessons would be the fruit of my labour. This poignant citation makes evident the link between a traumatic emigration in the British capital and literary creation. As I'm about to show, it seems London's publishing conditions and the positive attitude by British elite towards the French helped Madame de Souza to assert herself as a woman novelist. So who was this destitute noblewoman about to publish a European bestseller? Born in 1761, her life was stereotypical of a noblewoman in Ancien Régime France. I'll go back to her actually. She went to the convent, married an old but well-born nobleman, the Comte de Flao de la Billarderie. She held a heterogeneous salon in the Louvre, welcoming conservative aristocracy but also scientists, men of letters, and a few lovers, until she fled to London in September 1793. On her stay in London we know very little. Once back in France, she published numerous successful novels, amongst which was another émigré novel retracing the struggles of emigration, Eugénie and Mathilde, which I've put here. So what sort of risks did Madame de Souza take when publishing her first novel in England? The conditions for publishing in Paris before the Revolution were quite different from London. In Paris, patronage was still going strong, and noblewomen, despite their active cultural and political role as salonières, were still hesitant to become novelists. In England, the flourishing book trade, together with a more clement censorship, allowed some space for female voices, even if gender boundaries stayed firm. I propose to think about the specificity of the émigré novel to find out whether it helped our author to construct a stable identity as a female novelist. The risk of being unwomanly could come from publication and commercial success. The assertion of authorship was a double-edged sword for women. We know that Souza wrote for money when she was in London. We find mentions of her émigré friends, Talleyrand and Madame de Staël, visiting her in a miserable lodging above a grocer's to read and correct her draft. To counteract the loss of respectability, she had to make sure she followed the golden rules of the novel, making it close to a conduct book. She succeeded in that. Sainte-Beuve, a French critic, admired her sober tone, simplicity and charm, typically feminine qualities thought well adapted to novel writing. And yet something must have changed between this first novel, written in haste in a gloomy lodging in London, and her second fiction on emigration, once comfortably settled back in Paris, since we don't find an apologetic preface justifying the reasons behind her writing. Her experience as an émigré writer in London must have had an impact on the way she asserted herself as a female novelist. So what were the conditions of publishing in 1790s London for such a destitute French noblewoman? Souza had to find a patron or negotiate with a publisher. In England, despite the decrease of patronage, there were still some powerful social and cultural networks available for support, like for instance the Blue Stocking Circle. The spread of the subscription method meant that financial security was assured if the book sold well. The recourse to a publisher also suppressed the pressure of a difficult patron on the artist. We have few clues as to how Souza managed to publish her first novel. However, it is highly probable that she activated former relations in London. William Wyndham and Lord Wycombe frequented her salon when she was in Paris, and she knew influent émigrés such as Madame de Staël and Talleyrand, both in London at the same time. We don't have the subscription list, but 40,000 francs of subscription was mentioned. Her novel sold well and was warmly welcomed by other female authors, and the frequency of subsequent editions until 1827 attested to the general acclamation by the public. It is important to remember that Susa did not write about something hugely innovative. In fact, Adèle de Senange is very similar to the traditional 18th century sentimental novel, with twists and turns and ending with either marriage or death. If Adèle de Senange implicitly transposes the shattered fantasies of the author, it does not allude to the emigration in London itself, but takes place in a remote and idyllic France, and even has a happy ending. Consequently, the success received could not be explained by the thirst of Britons for dramatic scenes of emigration. And yet Susa's status as an émigré must have played in her favour, as the trend of novels about the revolution was at its peak in the 1790s in Britain. The debate about the revolution must have had an impact too. In the context of William Pitt's terror during the 1790s, the stereotypes of the eternal rival and the French dog were reactivated via propaganda. Reeves' association was central to that. Comparative prints systematically opposed the stability and wealth of Britain to the barbarous and miserable Republic of France. I've put just one example here, which you've probably came across, by James Gilray, where you can see the skinny revolutionary eating onions, raw onions, and a quite fat British man tucking into a nice roast beef. And it's called French Liberty versus British Slavery. These negative representations were challenged by the arrival of French émigrés in London in mass from 1792. The fact that French émigrés were victims of a despised revolution made the overcoming of national prejudices possible. Supporting French émigrés meant participating in the crusade against revolutionary ideas said to be spreading in England. The Wilmot Committee was created to support the émigrés, proving the existence of a Franco-British community. In this rapid mobilization of charity, women played a leading role in this rapid mobilization of charity, women played a leading role. The novelist Fanny Burney wrote a pamphlet to collect wider support, where she stressed compassion over national antagonism, integrated the émigrés within the community of Christians, and presented a respectable path in the public sphere for her female contemporaries. This intervention exhibited the dynamism of elite women's group and engagement in public life, something that offered a favourable environment for the publication of Susa's novel in London. Thus, Susa's novel responded to the need of the Franco-British readership of the 1790s, anxious to bring his support to an émigré of flesh and blood. From there, Susa found a way out of a restricted quest for authorship. She almost benefited from a privileged status as émigré novelist. Potentially, this innate justification could help her publish other novels, which she did whilst back in Paris. As for her readers, she would eternally be the author of Adèle de Senange. So, how did the emigration in London impacted on the plot of émigré novel? The greatest similarity in the texts I have examined is the recurrent references to British culture. I will explain now why those references are so recurrent, what made them special to the émigré, and how a foreign community such as French refugees engaged with British culture and writing. Prior to arriving onto British soil, noble émigrés were familiar with the Anglomania in France. The term was first used by Fougeray de Montbron in 1747 in his ferocious attack against the increasing number of admirers of Britain. From specifically copying British fashion to reading British novels, this admiration soon became politically charged as debates about the advantages of the British Constitution and liberty was fierce in the 1780s. These pre-existing representations were challenged by the reality of the exile and contact with the local elite. This reality was not that uncomfortable, though. For Adèle d'Osmond, the future Madame de Boigne, she actually saved her parents from poverty by hastily marrying a much older and also shocking at the time non-noble man in 1798. Claire de Kersin had recovered her family fortune in the French colony and attracted many suitors in London. She married the Duc de Duras and became Madame de Duras in 1797, but the Duke was penniless. Nevertheless, it gave her a prestigious title. Both Madame de Boigne and Madame de Duras lived close to Richmond, which was a settlement for the richest émigrés in London. By looking at their writings, we can get an idea of what they took from their exile in London. There are different ways in which these references were presented. It is important to consider the viewpoint from which the British culture was observed. It came from uprooted émigrés, and it is not surprising that they repeated pre-existing ideas they had on British society. And yet the émigré texts I have investigated are an individual take on the British cultural representations. So for Madame de Boigne, for instance, the relationship with British culture was constitutive of her identity. I will show you again Madame de Boigne. Madame de Boigne made the cultural features of England her own in her memoirs. She was 8 years old only when she first crossed the Channel. Among several appreciative portraits of English gentlemen, one stands out, John Lagarde, with whom she lived with her parents during her teenage years. It is striking that Boigne acknowledged the novelistic quality of his character straight away, saying he would fit really easily in novel. His portrayal was contrasted, Boigne balancing good qualities with less noble ones. She personalized the image of the independent country gentleman by interlocking his portrayal with her own apprenticeship of life abroad. Therefore, when reading Boigne's text, her experience is valued as the maker of her adult being. She adopted British culture so much that when she travelled back home, she admitted not feeling fully French. In the case of Madame de Souza, the references to England are structural and calculated. She could be considered as an Anglo-man of choice from her social network, but a forced exile from her country meant that she adopted also an Anglomania of circumstance. She opted for an elegant lord as the hero of her first novel. Lord Sydenham, who is also the first-person narrator. He is serious, generous, and genuine, and could easily please a British reader. Thus, this literary strategy betrays, on one hand, her opportunist approach to publishing in London, and on the other hand, it underlines her wish to follow the tradition of the novel of sensibility, first designed by the British. From the middle of the 18th century, there was a shift towards a categorization of the ideal British hero in French literature. Sensibility became a quasi-philosophy, increasingly associated with Britishness. The Vichy's painting these novels were stamped British and presented a new model of moral character, preferring personal worth over a prestigious rank. By enhancing this ideal British character, novelists were increasingly putting aside national antagonism, just like Souza had done. The naturalization of the English character made novelists co-opt English values and concerns. Consequently, via the figure of the British man, the immigrant novelists pictured an idealized moral parity between France and England. For Madame de Duras, the references to England take a more literary and personal meaning. Claire de Duras's case is different since she only published in the 1820s and was recognized straight away as a talented novelist for her works Ulrica and Edouard. Her other novels which, although unpublished, refer to England abundantly are Olivier ou Le Secret, Mémoires de Sophie and Amélie et Pauline, which has been published very recently. Duras scattered citations from British literature and poetry, making Britain the permanent point of comparison and also an inaccessible paradise. Because of her advantageous social position, even in exile, citing British authors seems logical and can appear as a way to display her education and honour the warm welcome she received in the capital. It is also utilised as a tool to make visible sensibility, just like for Sousa. For the protagonists Sophie and Amélie, British poetry gives the pretext to the first conversation with their lovers and reveals their compatibility. Love painted in British poems is fantasized hugely by the heroes, but never achieved. For Edouard, England is a country where the obstacles to his union with Natalie could be suppressed, and where genuine love exists within marriage. However, British poems can turn to be premonitory of a tragic end, or be a bitter reminder of what the characters will never have. One heroine says, "I will never be for somebody the dear reward of every virtuous toil." Another particularity appearing in Duras' novel is the constant inquiry about England, the will to discover its culture, and at times envy towards its socio-political system. In Olivier, England is a country where the eponym hero escapes from commitment. His frustrated lover becomes then obsessed with England as a result, desperately seeking information about it. "I felt pleasure in speaking about England," she says. What is certain is that England had several meanings for Duras, which she reactivated in her novels. I have found that in Duras' novel we can access an idea of Britain, of its literature, of its social, political system, and of its people, determined by personal experience and literary creation. Indeed, for émigrés, London corresponds with increased intimacy and strong emotions, that of conjugal love for her husband, followed by maternal love for her two daughters born in London. But it also represents a parenthesis of happiness she will never get back. When her lover, Chateaubriand, was made ambassador in London and started to neglect her, she too became obsessed with anything England related, and it's really obvious in her private correspondence. It is only logical then that she chose to apply English poetry and citations to her heroine's reflections on perfect love. Duras' memories about England therefore acquired a novelistic and emotional power. So to conclude, I will say that hopefully this brief overview on the works of female émigré writers will have brought an outsider's outlook on the notion of metropolitan institutions and British culture. I have tried to catch a glimpse at how non-British communities so engaged with British culture. I have considered throughout this paper the cultural institution that is the British novel and its influence on émigré writers, but also the émigrés' own take on the dynamic cultural life of London. Emigration pushed some noblewomen out of their comfort zone, which could be attributed to a favourable publishing market, the émigré witnessing British women writers penetrating the public sphere, or thanks to the personal enrichment exile equipped them with. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Our next speaker is Richard Summon, and he's going to talk on the Shoeblack Seraph Army, collective identity and the professionalisation of authorship in the 1830s. I'll keep the introduction brief, though. I have worked with Richard for many years, and I've enjoyed it immensely. He has a recent publication, a fantastic book, The Formation of the Victorian Literary Profession, which has just been published by CUP. I'll cut it short and leave it there, Richard.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks. Yes, I'm going to be speaking in a way to some of the material that I talk about in my book that's just been published. And the quotation in the title, Shoeblack Seraph Army, is taken from Thomas Carlyle. And so this paper really focuses on Carlyle in the 1830s, and there are two parts to it. So first of all, I'm going to talk about his interest in formulating professional community of authors. And then the second part, I'm going to look at his relationship to the community of the journal Fraser's Magazine. The broader context of this is my interest in the idea of professional community, in the development of professionalisation in the 19th century. Okay, so and I suppose I see professional authorship then as being necessarily a site of collective negotiation, as much as it may offer deeply internalised models of personal identity. At the same time, as sociologists and literary historians have sometimes noted, authorship doesn't fit particularly well with the normative expectations for a professional group. In the early 19th century, as today, there were no formal qualifications required for authors of novels, poems, or magazine articles. William Thackeray wrote in 1838 that literature and politics have this privilege in common, that any ignoramus may excel in both. No apprenticeship is required. So authorship could be characterised then as a relatively open profession, notwithstanding the often unspoken rules of membership, which police its boundaries in terms of class, gender and other stratifying categories, as with many other professional groups. London comes into this paper as of course, the gravitational centre of the literary marketplace and the publishing world, to which many aspiring professional authors of the 19th century were attracted. From the 1830s, there was indeed a flourishing subgenre of novels which depicted the journey of the naive young man or occasionally woman of the provinces to London in order to become a famous author, or resulting in authorship by chance, sort of à la Balzac's novel Illusion Perdue, which remained popular throughout the century, this sort of genre. Carlyle, I think, plays a formative role in imagining the possible collective identities of professional authorship into the Victorian period. So I want to begin by talking about his experience of literary London in the 1820s. So I've got some quotes here. In 1824, which I'll come on to in a moment, in 1824, the year which saw the publication of his first major works, a biography of Schiller and an English translation of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, Carlyle paid an extended visit to London, where he encountered what he calls in correspondence the literary world. And this visit was partly his attempt, I think, to work out whether London, as opposed to Edinburgh, should be, would be a suitable environment in which to launch his literary career. Although to some degree this experience proved positive, as Carlyle witnessed the first signs of his emerging critical reputation and made some important literary contacts, in other ways it was a very disillusioning experience. Indeed, such was the severity of his initial reaction to London that he spent most of the following decade living in an isolated farmhouse at Craigenputtock in Dumfriesshire, before eventually moving back, settling in London on a permanent basis in 1834. Of course, famously, he went on to become, sort of sage of Chelsea. So he's, so if you like, he becomes a sort of London-centred figure, a professional author, but he's an outsider from a sort of like provincial background. In a letter dated December 20th, 1824, to his wife Jane Bailey Welsh, Carlyle expressed his sense of the morally degenerate condition into which literature had fallen, and he cites a whole host of contemporary figures, including De Quincey, Hazlitt, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and so on, as examples of writers who had either succumbed to metropolitan corruption or were explicitly in exile from it. Good heavens, I often inwardly exclaim, and is this the literary world, this rascal rout, this dirty rabble, destitute not only of high feeling or knowledge or intellect, but even of common honesty? The very best of them are ill-natured weaklings. They are not red-blooded men at all. They are only things for writing articles. Though hardly unique, Carlyle's repugnance for the journalistic culture of the metropolitan literary world was peculiarly intense. His correspondence from the mid-1820s through to the end of the 1830s is full of him sort of railing against the practice of writing for magazines. He says in 1825, "I will not degenerate into the wretched thing which calls itself an author in our capitals and scribbles for the sake of filthy lucre in the periodicals of the day." And right through into the 1830s, he privately is sort of suggesting that the sort of sordid nature of becoming a periodical writer may well stop him from developing his career as a writer. Yet despite these expressions of contempt and aloofness, he acknowledges the difficulties of disentangling his own practice as an author from the necessities of this literary world, even when he's in this sort of self-imposed exile. In the letter to Jane from December 1824, Carlyle checks his outburst against the dirty rabble with this rueful confession: "In railing at them, let me not forget that if they are bad and worthless, I am yet as nothing, and that he who putteth on his harness should not boast himself as he that putteth it off. Unhappy souls, perhaps they are more to be pitied than blamed. I do not hate them, I would only that stone walls and iron bars were constantly between us." Which is a kind of ambiguous image. Is he imagining imprisoning all of the other sort of authors of London, or is he sort of imagining locking himself away, which perhaps seems preferable actually in some ways. But it's a sort of it's a rather extreme image of separation from the community, if you like, of literary London. But he's aware at this inaugural moment of his career that in putting on his harness as a periodical contributor, he risks compromising himself in his view. Carlyle's early apprehension of the equivocal status of the professional author perhaps is most strikingly revealed in an 1832 review essay on Boswell's Life of Johnson, which positions Johnson as representative of a new composite collective body, the unspeakable shoe-black seraph army of authors. It's a sort of oxymoronic figure then, with which Carlyle represents an earlier phase in the development of Grub Street, which combines the sort of high and the low possibilities of authorship in this startling juxtaposition that the professional author is both a shoe-black and a seraph. And Samuel Johnson offers a significant case study, since by the early Victorian period he was widely viewed as being the first major professional author. Carlyle perceived him as being among the first authors, the very first of any significance, who lived by the day's wages of his craft and composedly faced the world on that basis. And so he sees him as an important transitional figure in the genealogy of the modern man of letters. The implication of this essay is that Carlyle placed himself within a parallel historical predicament. Just as the mid-18th century experienced a shift from patrons to public, so the mid-19th century, he predicts, will witness the demise of the bookseller system and its replacement by some, as yet rather vague, third method of distribution. And the idea is that this third method of distribution, which will replace the bookseller system, is going to sort of address the chaos of the literary market as he sees it. Carlyle's writings of the early 1830s contain several abortive attempts to imagine alternatives to the bookseller system. And some of these, I think, do find their way into his later, better-known texts. An entry from in his private notebook for 1831, for example, contains the germ of an idea to which he returns frequently over the next decade. Authors must unite, must form themselves into a corporation, into a church. It is one of my prophecies that they one day will. In this present race there is not virtue enough to form a drinking club. So the forging of a new, more cohesive collective identity for authors, over and above the motley rabble of Johnson's shoe-black serif army and its contemporary successors, is the sort of main aim of Carlyle's desire to transform the social relations of production. Carlyle was by no means unique, of course, in calling for a literary union of professional authors during the 1830s. Bulwer Lytton, another prominent advocate during his editorship of the New Monthly Magazine, as was the early John Stuart Mill. I think particularly interesting about Carlyle's formulation of this idea, though, are the variety and the sort of combination of figures that he uses to represent this collective body. So corporation, church, and elsewhere in his notebooks, guild is another term that he uses. Such tropes invoke traditional models of both spiritual and secular authority, and at times he seems to conflate the two of them directly. The grand pulpit is now the press. The true church is the guild of authors, he declared in 1832. As David Reeder and others have argued, Carlyle's vision of the church of literature was an attempt to endow the man of letters with a sacerdotal aura, to some extent modelled on Coleridge's concept of the clerisy. But equally significant is the equivalence given to priestly and artisanal functions in the union of church and guild, suggesting a correspondent vision of the reorganisation of social labour. Carlyle intended to develop these ideas further in what he called an essay on authors, which he talks about a lot in his notebooks and correspondence of 1831, 1832. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he didn't get on to write his essay on authors. But the clearest description that we have of its content comes in a letter to the editor of the Edinburgh Review, McVeigh Napier, where he proposes to submit an article on the state of authors at this epoch, the duties, performances, and marvellous position of the author in our system of society, matters which, as I believe, will one day force themselves on the universal attention. It seems likely that this essay would have elaborated Carlyle's conception of the church or guild of literature and promoted the union of authors. It's significant that Carlyle conceived this project during a second period of temporary residence in London, whilst he was attempting unsuccessfully to secure the book publication for the manuscript of Sartorius Artus. Immersed once again in, I like this phrase, what he calls the reptile world of authors, he became convinced that while periodicals thrived, the book trade was in terminal decline, and bookselling must therefore work itself into quite a new form. Around about this period as well, there is his unfinished, unpublished History of German Literature, another project he was trying to develop, in which he makes some similar speculations about the development of literature as a profession. And in the introductory chapter of the history of German literature, Carlyle notes the lack of institutional structures supporting literature in its modern forms. There are no current equivalents to the medieval church and guild for regulating spiritual and material production. In recent times, he argues, literature has become established as a distinct sphere of labour. Going back to John's, some of the things that John was saying in his introduction this morning, yet without achieving legal definition as a recognised profession. So he says, literature, that strange composite set of agencies which men designate by that word, has in late times, as we see, obtained a specific name, so that we can now say an author as we say a carpenter or smith, and talk of the literary world as we do of the clerical, medical, legal. But this is nearly all the length we've got. not for the writer of books, whatever it might do for the binder of books, has government or custom hitherto passed any enactment, appointed any guidance or furtherance, better or worse, not so much as bound him to serve an apprenticeship. So I think it's interesting here, the sort of sense of unfamiliarity accompanying literature, the term itself, the emergence of literature as a separate cultural field. Carlyle observes the coming into existence of the vocation of author, and he compares it with more established trades and professions. I think it's suggestively indefinite, comparing authors with carpenters and with doctors. Does that suggest a trade, or does it suggest a profession? But he's unable to develop this comparison further. Authorship lacks the infrastructure of professional training through which guidance could be transmitted. Critics of Carlyle have tended to read such statements as implying a desire to impose the disciplinary order of the state onto the chaos of the market and laissez-faire, even to the extent of suggesting that he's interested in curtailing individual freedom of speech. Whilst this reading may contain a measure of truth, it's by no means certain to me that Carlyle had a settled opinion on the wisdom of government intervention within the literary market. He does lament the destructive consequences of laissez-faire, but also he acknowledges that literature cannot easily be legislated for, and he calls instead for what he calls a utopian community to effect the necessary reorganisation of authors. And also I think there's an uncertainty in his mind about whether suffering economic hardship within a literary market might not actually in the end be beneficial. An uncertainty about whether economic individualism was not perhaps partly responsible for engendering the moral discipline which he wants to associate with communitarian orders like the monastic or guild institutions. So he remains torn and ambivalent between the desire to redeem the professional author from the indignity of engaging in a sordid fight for material resources and to celebrate the heroic attributes which are often gained from precisely that struggle with the market. And that's where the ambivalence of his view of Johnson comes from in some ways. So it's partly perhaps for this reason that Carlyle's speculations on the Authors Guild seem quite tentative and vague, not just because he was prevented from developing his ideas to their full extent in published form. In contrast, perhaps, to Coleridge's idea of the clerisy, with which it bears an obvious similarity, Carlyle's notion of literature as a church was never really articulated with any attention to practical details. Ultimately, I think this is because Carlyle himself had not fully resolved whether the existence of such an institution would genuinely benefit authors and society. I'll just sort of note in passing that 20 years after Carlyle, Dickens, of course, became interested in this idea of developing an authors' guild, and he turned it into a much more practical and sort of concrete institutional form with his Guild of Literature and Art, 1851. And Dickens, of course, was certainly very influenced by Carlyle, though I guess he couldn't have read, some of these statements that I've been quoting from. The hero as man of letters is the famous lecture by Carlyle where he does allude to the idea of a literary guild, and I think that would have been something that Dickens would certainly have been influenced by. So move on to the second part now of my paper there. So during the 1830s, though, it could be argued that the same periodicals which Carlyle reviled were also engaged in shaping the collective identity of professional authorship beyond the status of things for writing articles. It's well known that Carlyle forged a particular association with Fraser's Magazine, the monthly Tory journal founded in 1830 under the editorship of William Maginn, and based in the London publishing house of James Fraser, another émigré Scot. Carlyle appears in Daniel Maclise's famous group portrait of male contributors to the magazine, The Fraserians, which is the image on the posters that we're all following. And this is completely coincidental, by the way. This is nothing orchestrated whatsoever about this. So this is The Fraserians, published in January 1835, Daniel Maclise's famous group portrait of male contributors, with Carlyle on the right there, I think. And William McGinn, the editor, at the centre of this picture, depicts him, it's a sort of image of conviviality, which depicts McGinn as a sort of host, surrounded by his guests in the middle of this round table, the centre of this round table. Fraser's later complimented this image, perhaps slightly grudgingly, you might say, with a collective portrait of contemporary women writers titled Regina's Maids of Honour, which is sort of a similar group portrait, but it's a lot more domestic. Unfortunately, I don't have that image with me, but they're gathered around a tea table, drinking tea. It's an interesting contrast. Moreover, one of the most distinctive features of Fraser's magazine during its first decade was a series of individual portraits, the gallery of illustrious literary characters, which ran continuously, more or less, from 1830 to 1838, and eventually totaled 81 full-length drawings of contemporary authors by Maclise, alongside character sketches in writing, mostly written by McGinn. Nigel Cross is one of a number of critics who's claimed that Fraser's gallery, as it became known, was one of the first attempts to construct a broader professional recognition of the literary character based on an inclusive survey of authors, not many of whom fit a sort of exalted model of genius. So a quotation from Nigel Cross, his book, The Common Writer. For the first time, the reading public were presented with physical presentations as well as biographical notes of contemporary editors, antiquarians, lady novelists, critics, and others who made up the literary core. To my mind, it's more difficult to claim that Fraser's gallery exhibits an ideologically coherent image of the literary profession. In the first place, McGinn's often scathing satirical sketches are not always seamlessly aligned with Maclise's informal but not unflattering style of visual portraiture. The collaboration of image and text sometimes can create an unsettling ambiguity of meaning. Moreover, while it's not difficult to discern Fraser's politically and commercially motivated prejudice against the Whig dandies of rival magazines, it's worth noting that McGinn's irreverence extends pretty much to everyone, including more conservative figures such as Scott and even to Carlyle himself, his own contributor. What distinguishes Fraser's gallery from other examples of the genre, I think, is its playful self-consciousness as a mediation of celebrity, literary celebrity, and of cultural visibility. So one example might be the figure of Scott, which opens the gallery in November 1830. McGinn begins this sketch, this character sketch of Scott, by locating Maclise's portrait of the writer within a much broader field of visual representations. On the opposite page, he says, is old Sir Peveril. Many a time has he figured on canvas or paper, in stone, bronze or plaster, in oil or watercolours, lithographed, copper-plated, mezzo-tinted, in all the variety of manner that the art of the sculptor, the founder, the modeller, the painter, the etcher, the engraver, the whole tribe of the imitators of the face divine could display him. He has hung in the chamber of kings and decorated the door of the alehouse, has graced the boudoir of beauty, and perambulated the streets borne upon the head of a swarthy Italian peddler. He has been depicted in all moods and all postures, but we venture to say that the baronet, as he really looks, was never so exactly put before the public as we now see him. So rather than using his verbal sketch to comment directly on the naturalistic style of Maclise's portrait, McGinn in fact positions Scott at the centre of a sort of whole industry of visual representation. And you know, when you read through the sort of list, the sort of itemised list of all the various different places and methods by which Scott's image is reproduced, you might think it rather undermines the bit at the end where he says, but this is the real Scott, as it were. So it's hard, I think, perhaps to avoid a conclusion that Scott's professional identity is perhaps in danger of being reduced to a sort of mass-produced visual image here, even though he is kind of praising Scott for his inventive genius. So that's the context of Fraser's Gallery. Carlyle himself was one of only 3 literary contributors to Fraser's Gallery. He wrote a sketch on Goethe for publication in March 1832. It's very different in tone from McGinn's satirical mode. Carlyle's accompaniment to Maclise's portrait of Goethe seems very much at odds with the rest of the series. When McGinn subverts the prevailing idiom of biographical portraiture, which is quite sort of reverential treatment, Carlyle was an enthusiastic supporter of the sort of sacred function of biography, if you like, sacralizing function of biography. And he, of course, went on to become an exponent of the doctrine of hero worship. But Carlyle's awareness of the dissonant context in which the essay is to appear does not reflect an outright rejection of the literary gallery as a visual conceit. In fact, he begins by adapting McGinn's style of ekphrasis, if you like, of commenting on the image to his own purposes. Reader, thou here beholdest the eidolon of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So looks and lives now in his 83rd year, afar in the bright little friendly circle of Weimar, the clearest, most universal man of his time. Strange enough is the cunning that resides in the 10 fingers, especially what they bring to pass by pencil and pen. Him who never saw England, England now sees. From Fraser's Gallery he looks forth here, wondering doubtless how he came into such a Lichtstrasse. In Carlyle's sort of etymology, the word eidolon seems to be translated as both symbol and a thing seen. The term is commensurate then with the discourse of secular idolatry and iconoclasm in which Fraser's Gallery humorously participates, but Carlyle seems to use it in a more earnest and a sort of more charged sense than McGinn. Maclise's portrait of Goethe is not simply an extraneous visual image, a thing seen, on the same level as the mass-produced images of Walter Scott, but appears to be animated by an immanent symbolic capacity. Hence this strange idea of a kind of reciprocity of visual encounter, which this portrait supposedly enables. So not only does it allow England to see Goethe, but Goethe is seeing England almost as if he's sort of peeping out of the pages of Fraser's magazine at the Reader. The Gallery of Illustrious Literary Characters was one of numerous literary portrait galleries published from the 1820s to the middle of the 19th century and beyond. David Higgins has documented the emergence of this genre in his study of romantic literary magazines. The distinctive in character Fraser's Gallery was far from unique in attempting to represent professional authors as a collective body. The genre grew to encompass both high and low variants, as well as spanning both contemporary and historical subjects, the living and the dead. Fraser's rival, the New Monthly magazine, began a short-lived series of living literary characters in 1831, which adopted a much more reverential approach to its subjects. In contrast to Maclise's full-length portraits of authors in relaxed, naturalistic poses, they offered this much more formal, monumentalized style of portraiture, if you like, a sort of classical, the half-length classical bust. clearly an attempt to sort of present its subjects as sort of worthy of commemoration in some way, possibly in direct response to Fraser's. Both of these literary galleries participate in what could be described, borrowing a phrase from Leo Braudy, as a competition of images surrounding the cultural value of professional authorship during the 1830s. Notwithstanding the contested nature of the subject matter, galleries such as these testify not so much to the force of charismatic individual personalities as to the significance of the collective and indeed serial practice of writing on a professional scale. So to sort of come to a conclusion, later in life Carlyle became known for his enthusiasm in supporting the establishment of the National Portrait Galleries both in England and Scotland. It could be argued that his endorsement of these public institutions sited within actual space, though symbolic space, was in fact influenced by the figurative space of the literary portrait galleries constructed within early 19th century print media. By the 1840s, so these literary galleries predate the National Portrait Galleries in the 19th century. By the 1840s, Carlyle's literary celebrity was such that he himself frequently featured in such texts, a presence which seems peculiarly apposite as he both assimilates and reinterprets the iconographic model on which the genre of the literary gallery was based within his own writings. 19th century readers of Carlyle were perhaps more liable to notice this generic context of his writing than subsequent commentators have been. In her autobiography, Harriet Martineau praised Carlyle as a biographer for the fine gallery of portraits which he has given us. She has in mind, I think, the same format popularised by Fraser's magazine in the 1830s. Towards the end of this decade, Carlyle began to look beyond the periodicals for a possible remedy to his personal difficulties in the literary world. The sequence of annual lecture courses which he delivered from 1837 to 1840, culminating in On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, was the result of a self-conscious decision to move away from his dependence on magazine writing in the absence of a reliable method of publishing books. Lecturing provided Carlyle with a steady and lucrative source of income relative to the amount of time and labour invested, and he had social prestige. This seems initially to him preferable to the Grub Street world of the periodicals. However, as I've tried to suggest, in framing some of his most influential speculations on the literary profession, Carlyle was in fact still immersed in the experiences of the preceding decade, experiences which led him to consider the advantages of an author's guild, but also to value the opportunity of looking at an author's picture.
Okay, we've got a fair amount of time to have a discussion. I know we started slightly late, so
yeah.
David will be in charge of exactly when we want to curtail this discussion if we are able to be productive. I'll throw it open immediately to everybody present. So we are responding to all three presentations, so maybe if we have the three people at the front, that would be useful. Okay. Brilliant.
Yeah, fascinating. Just to get the discussion going, and picking up the title of Creative Community and Institutions. What struck me about hearing the three papers is they're about authors as producers. There's no community between many of the people. The three emigre authoresses probably didn't meet one another. The people at Fraser's never were in a room together, I suspect. And so there's no community between these people the way there might have been, say, in the previous century, where the learned men of a town might meet together for dinner and discussing and considering the drafts of their books. And so rather than thinking of it as a community, or even as an institution, would it not be an easier way to think of what's going on in this period as an industry? You know, this is an industry which is now very large. It has a huge infrastructure of non-authors on whom it depends, not just the printers and the publishers, but all the magazines and the production and the copy editors and the indexes. And that what these three papers are giving us are the self-presentation of the people at the top of this industry. That this is the way they want to be thought, that they are independent of all those money. And if we wanted to follow it that way, then where would the Royal Literary Fund dinners and nurses fit in? And I was thinking that the Fitzgerald, which I hadn't heard of, I must have read it, but a speech of that kind could be delivered to any trade association. If it had been a trade association of army officers or of shipbuilders or of railways or something, of bankers, the same sort of things could be said. You know, that ours are better than those of the French and everything. We could all take together and look after our less fortunate. So what I think we're not really being given a community here. We've been given an industry's self-presentation of the leaders to themselves. How's that?
Any of the speakers want to take that up?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I certainly see what you mean. I think from my point of view, I suppose that's one of the things that I'm interested in about, you know, the idea of professionalism and what kinds of group solidarity, if you like, does that entail. You know, in some ways, in this paper, I was kind of presenting it as you know, engaged with a marketplace which might be seen as quite sort of atomizing to Carlyle and kind of anti-community. He obviously aspires to something else. I suppose, you know, to be honest, he wasn't exactly the most clubbable kind of figure. So I wasn't claiming in my paper to sort of present him as somebody who, in actual fact, would be very good at mixing. But he's interested in the idea. It's a bit abstract. I do admit that. I think periodicals are maybe slightly different. I mean, I do think that, well, it's certainly an image of community, isn't it? Sort of Freitzerians. I think they, I don't know if David might know more about whether they actually met. I think they did attempt to, I think Miriam Thrall in her book on Fraser's magazine does suggest that they did actually meet up in Regent Street, I think. So I think with periodicals, there's that implication, there's that sort of uncertainty perhaps about how much is it a virtual community, how much is it actually based in a sort of concrete space, and the sort of self-presentation, as you put it, is a way of sort of, you know, negotiating that sort of area, isn't it, I think?
I think, just to chip in quickly, there is a sense in which it's partly a fantasy, isn't it, that image of the Freitzerians, that they weren't all in that place, and they certainly weren't all there in 1835, because Coleridge is there and he was dead by then. But nonetheless, I think there were at least attempts to bring some of the contributors together at dinners, and they did take place. And there are other examples like, you know, John Murray, the publishing house, and there were quite regular meetings of his sort of authorial stable, weren't there? Yep. And Blackwood's as well. Part of the sort of Noctis Ambrosiana is a fantasy of community, but there is something underpinning that fantasy as well. And how much underpins a fantasy might depend on the sort of periodical. I don't know if it becomes. I mean, I do take your point, William, that as things become more industrialised and bigger and more complex, it's much harder to sort of bring people together in sort of clubbable sociability. I do see that. Greg, you would want to?
I suppose I was just.
Are you on the same topic? Or?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Okay.
I suppose I was thinking about David Trotter's book, Paranoid modernism and the way in which, from what I remember of it, he was talking about literature in the 1890s and towards the 20th century having a paranoid structure, and I wonder whether that is also quite useful, because the question of whether or not, the literary communities seem to be working in various ways, whether virtually or locally or more or less strongly. But I wonder whether part of the problem Carlyle might be feeling is that it's not functioning like a guild in a way, that you can be part of this profession and yet not know where you are in it. 1 week you're in the magazine, next week you're not. That your point, Matthew, about the seat placings would be useful to know, because that's one way of kind of gauging where you are objectively. I'm doing all right, but I'm not doing that well. And the saloniers, I suppose, of the 18th century, whether you got admitted to a salon or not, whose salon you got admitted to, there would be sort of objective markers of where you were within a community that might have helped you to understand its structure and also your position as an agent within it. And I wonder whether that isn't some part of the problem with authorship as a profession, as opposed to being a carpenter, is that you're in a state of perpetual paranoia. That's why you end up cultivating genius, because the only thing you can look to is the top. Any other thought breeds incessant anxiety. I don't know what the point of that is, just to think that actually maybe community, the very freedom. I suppose maybe one contrast would be our own profession, because you were talking about it. In some ways, what we enjoy most about the academic profession is it does provide us with lots of intellectual freedom, but it does provide us with kinds of structure which can be more or less hierarchical. At their best, they're not very hierarchical, but they still tell you where you are. And that's what authorship. That's perhaps the problem of authorship.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm just going to go back to the idea of an industry as much as a metaphor and a process as a sign of the implementation or the arrival of a kind of factory system, if you like, for literature and a mechanisation of its processes. I think one of the things that we've encountered already within this network, and again the network perhaps is symptomatic of what Greg's saying. In other words, to what extent is a network in itself creative, or is it what a network produces that are creative? In other words, we're merely a talking shop rather than producing an output as currently most obviously institutionally recognised. And it seems to me that goes back to this idea of what narrative of labour or work or creativity are we talking about? I mean, going back to Matthew's paper, it seemed to me, one of the things that you were assuming, and you, like the rest of us, moving towards, was the idea that creative communities have to transform. They have to take a raw product, they have to process it and turn it into a product. And it's the product that we are conditioned and programmed to speak to. I mean, typically the product you chose was the ceremonial product, even if it took the unusual form of an after-dinner speech. But it was an after-dinner speech, recognisably a product of the kind that we know about. That's to say, you were able to say it was in certain kinds of heroic couplets. In other words, the product that emerged, even through a convivial process of congress between people, was in fact a literary product. That's what we were on the lookout for as part of that factory process, if you like. So I just wanted to add that to the mix, that in some ways it's a very beguiling narrative of creation, of turning creation into the production of outputs or products, akin to the metaphor of the factory, as it were. Just want to throw that into the mix. I know you're afraid to correct.
If I can just speak to William's point.
Yeah.
They are, it seems to me, like the London magazine where Quincy's writing, or Sartre versus Sartis. What maybe makes it a little bit different is they are listening to one another. And by that I mean that, for example, the Quincy writing in the London magazine, Taylor and Hesse have got sort of a house style, and they've got a sort of this is a bit of John Plancher, but they've got a voice they want to hear. Greg and I were talking about this in a context now. But if the Quincy sits down to write Confessions of an English Oak Meter, he's got the London magazine context very firmly in his head. And so even if they're not in the same room together, De Quincey can hear that Hazlitt is a voice in the London magazine, that Lamb is a voice, that John Scott is a voice, and he, it seems to me, tailors that article to that context, and he's aware that his article will appear alongside other people's articles. So I would say that Sartor Resartus is one of the really great examples, because you have Carlyle over and over and over again decrying the periodical press, and yet when he writes Sartor Resartus, there's I think of those as magazine articles, you know, par excellence, because he's so clearly listening to the other voices in Fraser, and it suits the Fraserian context so brilliantly well. So it's Carlyle decrying something that he understands intimately. And when you read Sartor Resartus, like in the World Classic, it really does it an injustice. If you read Sartor Resartus in Fraser's magazine, alongside the other articles that Carlyle can hear in the other voices. So I would say there's more of a community element involved than you're suggesting, because even if they're not in the same room, they're aware that it's a corporate, creative, communal enterprise. And if De Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Open Meter as he intended for Blackwood's magazine, they had a fight and he left. But if he had continued to write it for Blackwood's magazine, you would have got a different version. That is to say that the creative community that was Blackwood's is opposed to the creative community that was London, and De Quincey would have heard, as it were, Blackwoodian voices to a greater extent. So I think that there is a communal group sense that maybe belies the notion of an industry a little bit, or Paul?
One of the things that interested me about the Royal Literary Fund dinners was you were suggesting that there was a kind of formalisation of those in a way that became more formal, and perhaps there's a contrast there with the kinds of, you know, with the image of the Fraserians, where that's a sort of self-presentation of a kind of less formal community. The idea is that they're a bit sort of bohemian, aren't they? You know, they're not the sort of stuffed shirts, as it were. You know, you do read accounts of people going to those RLF dinners and being bored out of their minds, as you were saying. So it seems that in a way they're both kind of similar on one level, aren't they? As being representations of a literary community, but actually quite different in terms of how they would see themselves as kind of formalised.
And there's an element of that of monumentalising, isn't there? In your notions of the gallery, and in the different versions of that, the difference between the Goethe and, as it were, the bust of Scott, and the different degrees to which what they want to do is in some ways you can't help but think it's a manifestation of a kind of lack of confidence, or a worry, this anxiety that Greg's talking about the ephemeral, about not having anything that will last. Therefore we need to produce as a community, even if it's a repeated ritual of a dinner or a gallery that you can go back to and you can frequent, and you can see all these figures who in many ways might otherwise, and certainly earlier, have been anonymous, see them named and figured and present before you. Where, I mean, in some ways it's overcoming an anxiety about within the culture of this kind of writing, an anxiety about writing as a kind of absence, really, rather than a full-bodied presence. I mean, so that the version of yourself as a man, I mean, going back to your first quotation from the letter in 1824, is that what you get is black and white, bleached out masculinity rather than full-blooded men. So in order to redeem that, then what you want is representations of a real guy who stares back at you from the page, you know, which is so Goethe becomes the paradox of that situation, where he's a living, breathing guy who's not only you're looking at, but he has the capacity you know, to look back rather than speak back to you. So there's a kind of redemption going on there in a certain kind of way about the problems associated with the productivity of writing, which doesn't give you other aspects of self-working.
Well, I mean, last week we had a great talk from the Hazlitt Day. We had a great talk from a guy from the Garrett Club who was talking about Charles Matthews' theatrical portraits, precisely this period. He's collected them and has this little house museum in Highgate, and then when he loses all his money, sells it to the Garrick. And I suppose that's a kind of the same kind of narrative, isn't it, moving into the 1830s as the I attempts towards monumentalisation that you're describing. I suppose, one of the things I suppose for early Victorians would be the extent to which the gentleman's club is the kind of model, but it's also not the answer, because Dickens was, I think, a member of all of them. But that sense in which it's obviously seeking after a certain kind of professional dignity and status, but it doesn't. There are problems to do with authorship and the literary market that it doesn't resolve. Actually, it just kind of sidesteps, I suppose.
There's a star system problem there, isn't there, as well? One of my favourite literary fan anecdotes is when Williams in the 1780s is trying to get patrons. He turns up at Edmund Burke's early in the morning, and Edmund Burke says very magisterially, "Authors, scribblers are the pest of the country, and I will not be troubled with them." And Williams is quite annoyed by this, so comes back to him, "Sir, if you had not been an author, you would have been a bog trotter." And then the meeting does not recover from this. But I think it highlights something quite interesting, that authorship for Burke is a stage he goes through in order to become an individual in society. And this is one of the problems with authorship as a profession, that you don't really want to be known as a professional author. If you do it, you want to be known as yourself. You want to transcend that environment in a way that you don't. In something like law, you want to move up and you're quite happy to be judge. Your name is not the important part. But in authorship, your name is the important part. So with all of these sort of community processes, there's a conflict here, in that what you really want to be known as the leading member in the community. You want to be the person in the portrait, not the person writing the portrait, the sort of description of the article about the person in the portrait. And that is something that I think continually undermines all of these means of trying to make authors lovable, particularly when the industry doesn't pay very well, although it continues right through. You don't get the Society of Authors until very late in the 19th century.
I think one of going back to John's early points about labour, is that there's still that sort of sense that work is ungentlemanly, isn't there? And that goes well into the early Victorian period. And so there's a sort of fantasy, I think, about the image of the Frisarians, or the idea of the party, that what's produced in, say, a magazine, it just sort of happens by this sort of magical sort of club or sociability. It's not really about putting in hours like a labourer would, or like the typesetters and people that William referred to. But there's something much more magical like it. So it might be seen as a sort of communal version of a sort of an idea of individualistic inspiration. This is a more of a sort of clubbable party like inspiration. The leisure versus labour, I suppose, is quite important here.
It's like that sort of the division between genius and talent. That talent is the sort of the worthy slogger who sort of does produce, is represented as producing work. It's sort of a way in the garret. What you really want to be is the genius from whom things sort of descend on purely. Which
it's the idea of the magazine as genius, I suppose.
Yeah.
In that sense.
These blokes have plenty of time to sit around drinking, because at least just dash off without something laborious.
I think just on that point, I suppose Carlyle might be somebody who he does talk a lot about work, doesn't he? He does adhere to a sort of value of work, but maybe the term work or labour means something slightly different to him. I mean, it's not perhaps the sort of nitty-gritty, as it were, but it's he wouldn't like the idea that there's no effort in doing it. I mean, produce is the sort of motto of Sartre or Sartre's. You've got to work. So I would say that that's not a text which hides the fact that it's being produced. Far from it, in the sense it's wanting to say this is about labour, but perhaps it's not kind of labour at the equivalent level of typesetters, or just what I mean. I think it's a kind of it's a kind of etherealised.
I think,
to
but
some
I think
degree
he's
labour.
partly reacting to what he still sees as a sort of rather the ethos of the gentleman amateur that still exists to some extent in the literary world, even in an attenuated form. But I mean, I think you're right. Carlyle is he's sort of, I wouldn't want to see him as just straightforwardly marking a shift, but he is doing something different from, say, how even Blackwoods are doing sort of 10 years earlier.
Sorry, I've got what's really a fairly pedestrian question, but I think it's got some interesting implications. I was wondering about the production selection of those portraits. Obviously, Thomas Carlyle's doing the written portrait, but I mean, is the artist of the drawing named? Does the drawing follow the written portrait? Does the written portrait follow the drawing? Do they ever actually look at the original before they draw them? And this is what I was wondering. I mean, how much is the representation of what that author is deemed to look like as, you know, their persona, and how much is it, you know, they've actually got Walter Scott to come and stand still for 4 hours as somebody draws it, and to what extent? I just wonder what that relationship is, whether there's kind of physiognomical relationship between what's written and what's represented.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I don't know if I can answer that entirely fully. I mean, Maclise is the artist, but I can't remember whether he would have been involved in actually engraving or whether he was just sort of drawing sketches. But some of them were actually based on other portraits. So, for example, the image of Goethe apparently was from a sketch by Thackeray, who was in Weimar in the 1820s. He did a sketch. He met Goethe, did a sketch of him, passed it on to Maclise, who then did that design. His pseudonym, Maclise's pseudonym was Croquis, sketch. Is that right? Croquis. Is that right? I think it means sketch, doesn't it? Yeah, sketch. Okay, so that was his that was the official pseudonym, signature, Croquis. Which came first, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think it seems like McGinn is often referring to the images, so he's seen the images, suggest that they were there before him as he wrote.
Yeah, this is the other part of that question. I wondered then who's selecting who the video portrait of? Is it based on the portraits they have available, or are they trying to select a certain series? Are there any women other than in the Regina's Handmaids? Are there any individual women?
Yeah. I think, I mean, there's an awful lot of them. I mean, there's 80 odd portraits. So I think why it's sometimes seen as being quite significant, because it's not, you know, it does seem to be quite sort of, they cast their nets quite widely. You know, it's not that selective. You know, so it's people like magazine editors, contributers, in Cross's phrase, lady novelists. So yes, there's quite a lot of women writers in there. I couldn't tell you exactly how many.
It's not copied, is it? I mean, there's no equivalent for the other great magazines in the Victorian period. I mean, there's not all the year round contributors to that. It's just a one-off, which is not specific to that particular moment in group of people in Fraser.
It's quite interesting. They spend a lot of time talking about the writers that write for them. In other words, it's the Noctes and Rosianis, or the magazine, talking about the magazine and giving it a cultural weight. Because Carlyle writes so many letters about loathing the periodical press because it's ephemeral, it's periodical, and he wants to become a writer of books because that's what authors produce. But he has this terrible struggle. The magazines pay. He writes really important articles, I think, in the late 1820s for the Edinburgh Review, and he gets paid very well. And he's in knots about this is where the money is, but he doesn't. Well, he keeps reflecting on the medium that he despises but can't live with.
And that's back to Greg's point, isn't it? This person, sorry, sir.
I just wanted to ask Matthew. I really enjoyed the start of the paper, and the Prince thing I thought really worked. But the Prince 1999 song for me is like a hedonism. It's the world's going to end, and there's no chains to us, so we're going to party because the apocalypse is coming. So what does it matter anyway? And I guess in another Prince song, like, you know, you don't have to be rich to be my girl. It's this kind of sense of like, don't worry about material things. And yet the reason why the Royal Literary Fund is being set up in the first place is a huge worry about material things. You don't want to be the Hogarth print of the poet with his bish, you know, wondering how he's going to get a poem to come. And that's this kind of, I thought the interesting thing about, you know, a party which is still based around the work environment, say like a staff Christmas party or something like that, where there's a kind of, there's an obvious tension, because, you know, you were telling us how drunk everyone was getting, but there's a kind of underlying tension to getting that drunk and having that much hedonistic fun when you're there for that purpose. So I was wondering whether in the actual reports of the meetings or of the parties, were they trying to get donations out of people when they were inebriated? Was there extra donations that night apart from the ticket? Was the money incentive still going on while this apparent hedonism was?
It's hard to tell with the early days. By the dinners in the early 20th century, you had your menu card with the speeches, and on the back there was both a cheque and a pen to fill out when you had been impressed with these things. So one would suspect that also earlier, yes, there's definitely things like that sort of going on. I was planning on ending with another Prince song, which is "Sign of the Times," which is the dinners are sort of trying to signify the moment that they're happening in order to sort of broaden out literature to sort of be applicable to everyone somehow. But you're right, the sort of pure it is a sort of watched kind of hedonism, particularly later on once the dinners are more reported. I think the earlier ones are quite bacchanalian, but later they sort of reach that point that Williams reaches, where they realise they can't self-indulgently all do their poetry, and it has to be rather more closely managed. Interestingly, they spin off a second dinner which happens in Greenwich a bit later in the year at that point for the Literary Fund Club, so they have a private version where they can all do their poems, but for the main dinners, yes, they're designed to impress, in fact, the donations at the dinners thing is awkward, because written on the tickets is no donation will be taken, but I think informally there's definitely a sort of nudge, would you perhaps care to increase your subscription? And there are, in the later folders, there are paper slips where people have written pledges on very scrappy paper slips, like torn off corners of the menu, which the secretary then carefully mounted on blue paper as the record that, yes, you did say this last night.
Greg, did you want to?
If there's time, I suppose it's a question about kind of asylum seekers, really. From what I gathered, you were talking about the way in which sensibility was the currency of these novels, both to the addressed to the French community in London and possibly back in Paris and France. And I suppose I was wondering, was that because really politically they're quite embarrassing, really, that it's difficult to know what to do with emigres in the 1790s, from a British point of view at least, because in some ways they're, unless you cast them as victims, it's difficult, that you have to be an extreme Tory to want to uphold them as sort of paragons of, civilization, because they're part of they're the problem that caused the revolution in a way, and they're the excess from which British liberty is always wanting to retreat. So that just to cast them as victims enables you to avoid the whole political question in a way. Is that right? And is that why the novels are the way they are?
Well, the sensibility is. Mainly, I think they chose to write novels of sensibility because that was the fashion before they left France. That was what the perfect novel would be, and that was probably what they read before. There were loads of British novels, and it sold really well in Paris before. So that's probably the reason why they chose that first hand. Then, yes, during a English character in it could help to have more readers in England, and maybe make like for Madame de Souza, when she wrote it to survive, and she published it in London, so she felt probably that she wanted to justify herself in front of the British public, like, look, I'm respectable, I'm not like all of the others. If you read the novel, it's really it praises tolerance. It's not about conservative ancien regime. It's not revolutionary. It's just in the middle. So it would have pleased certain political ideas. So I think it's a mix of the two, really. With other émigrés, the one like Madame de Duras published after, this idea of sensibility is less strong, and it's a lot different because she wasn't publishing for survival in London. So maybe it's more intertwined with the emotional impact of a stay in London. So it's a different story, but yeah. Well,
are they quite different then from, because around that time, 1794, that's when all the Girondin fictions are coming out, aren't they? They're being translated often and published by Joseph Johnson, and they've all got a a model of moderate revolution from which the Jacobins have, kind of renamed, and so they succeed in being sort of fictions of, or like narratives of sensibility that are nevertheless kind of liberal and republican.
But I thought they were written in French. Is that right? So they're given to English-speaking young ladies so that they can learn manners. So they're not conduct books masquerading as romance.
Yeah, they were written in French. Yeah, they were, and because from what I've seen in memoirs and different testimonies from that moment, the most privileged émigrés who were able to find their old friends in London, the one they had in their salon back in Paris, were fluent in English, and similarly, the British elite was speaking French as well. So it was kind of polite to speak to them in English for French émigrés, for the English to speak back in French to show that they mastered the French. And so reading a French novel written by an émigré was quite well seen, if you like. So that's why they were published in French.
I mean, what you mentioned early on, the connection between the trauma of their flight from France and the creativity. Could you say a little bit more about where is that trauma manifest in these sentimental romances?
Yeah, that's something I've looked at in more extent. That's one of the main focus of my research, really. I've not really talked about it today, but it's really interesting. I'm trying to adopt a multidisciplinary approach with psychoanalysis and sociology and all that, and try to find really to see where the trauma happens in literature. What can tell us? What can a novel tell us about the trauma of the author, what they went through, etc., etc. So far, what I have found is that there is the recurrent image of England as a two-sided element, either something of a lost happiness, a lost heaven of happy memories, something that you will not find again, especially when the writer is writing during Napoleon's or after, when the situation is not great for aristocrats back then. It's not ideal. Or the other element is Britain as really a traumatic experience. Like, it's almost like they don't want to mention it. They just they ignore it. For Madame de Souza, her émigré novel is not, apart from the Lord, the main hero is English, and there is loads of references to England, but the plot is in France, in a idyllic setting, and there is no mention of the revolution or any political idol, really vaguely. So it's like she was just trying to live in a dream world, really, while she was in immigration. And her later émigré novel, once she was back in France, doesn't allude to England. It's an emigration in Holland. So there is this kind of
different kinds of erasure, really.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? I think we've seen the lunch be delivered, so that's probably distracted us by now. Can I just thank the three speakers for their patience?